The evening breeze always carried a sense of calmness to the small coffee shop that stood on the corner of the quiet street. It was not one of those fancy, modern cafes with big lights and flashy signs. Instead, it was warm, cozy, and simple, a place where the smell of roasted beans lingered in the air and soft music played in the background. The young woman behind the counter had grown used to the steady rhythm of her night shifts. She greeted the usual customers, cleaned tables, and kept herself busy, never expecting anything extraordinary to happen in her quiet little world. Then, one night, he walked in. At first, nothing seemed unusual about him. He wore a plain shirt, dark pants, and carried himself with a calm, almost quiet presence. He wasn't the kind of person who drew attention with loudness or flashy clothes. Instead, he moved with a kind of gentle confidence, the kind that made people step aside without even realizing why. He walked up to the counter, his eyes meeting hers only briefly, and said in a low voice, "One black coffee, please." She nodded, prepared his order, and placed the steaming cup on the counter. He gave a polite smile, thanked her softly, and walked to the corner table by the window. That was all. The next night, he returned. Once again, he ordered the same thing, black coffee, and once again, he chose the same corner seat. She thought maybe he was just someone passing through the area who liked coffee at night. But then he came again. And again. Every night, without fail, he walked into the shop, ordered his simple drink, and sat quietly in that same seat, sipping slowly, sometimes staring out the window, sometimes lost in his own thoughts. At first, she found it curious. Why would someone come every single night just for a plain cup of coffee? Most customers who became regulars usually had a reason: either they lived nearby, studied late, or simply enjoyed talking. But this man wasn't like that. He barely spoke more than a few words. He didn't seem interested in small talk. He never pulled out a phone or laptop like others did. He simply sat there with his coffee, and after about 30 minutes, he would leave quietly, almost as if he had never been there at all. She began to notice the small details about him. His hair was neatly combed, though sometimes it looked like he had run his hands through it too many times after a long day. His eyes carried a depth she couldn't quite describe, as if there were countless stories hidden behind them. He never looked rushed, but there was a certain heaviness in the way he carried himself, as if his shoulders bore invisible weight. He wasn't old, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, but there was something about him that made him seem older, not in years but in experience. The young woman, curious by nature, sometimes wondered about him while wiping down the counters. Was he lonely? Did he live nearby? Was he waiting for someone who never showed up? She would catch herself making up little stories in her head about him. Perhaps he was a writer, thinking quietly about his next story. Or maybe he was someone who had lost someone dear and found comfort in the silence of the coffee shop. Whatever the reason, he kept coming back every night, and with each visit, his presence became part of her routine too. There were nights when the shop was nearly empty, and she could hear the clock ticking softly on the wall. On those nights, she would glance at him sitting in the corner, sipping his coffee slowly. He seemed to belong to the silence, like a shadow blending into the dim light. She found herself oddly comforted by his quiet visits. She didn't know him, not even his name, but there was something strangely steady about his presence, something that made the lonely hours of her shift feel less empty. She never imagined he could be anything more than just a regular customer. To her, he was just a man who liked coffee at night, nothing more, nothing less. She never guessed that behind his calm eyes and simple routine was a life filled with responsibilities, secrets, and a story far greater than she could imagine. But for now, in those early nights, it was simple. He came, he ordered, he sat quietly, and he left. And she, though curious, respected his silence. Their exchanges remained polite and brief. A soft good evening from her, a gentle thank you from him. Nothing else. Nothing to suggest that fate had quietly placed their paths together in this small corner of the world. And yet, sometimes, when she wiped down his table after he left, she would notice the little things he left behind: a folded napkin, a slightly smudged coffee cup, a faint scent of his cologne in the air. These small traces made her feel like he wasn't just another customer. There was something more, though she couldn't name it yet. Something that made her look forward, just a little, to the sound of the bell above the door announcing his arrival every night. The girl didn't know it then, but those quiet visits, those simple cups of black coffee, were the beginning of something that would change both of their lives. For him, the coffee shop wasn't just a place for coffee. It was an escape, a brief refuge from the storm of his world. And for her, though she had no idea who he really was, his presence was becoming more than just routine. It was becoming a story she was unknowingly part of, one that would unfold night by night, cup by cup, until the truth would eventually reveal itself in ways she never expected. The days began to blend into one another, and yet, every night felt slightly different whenever he walked through the door of the coffee shop. She had grown used to hearing the bell ring above the entrance, and without even looking up, she somehow knew it would be him. The way his steps were steady but unhurried, the way he nodded politely before ordering, it all became a familiar pattern that gave her nights a quiet rhythm. At first, their conversations never went beyond the simple exchange of words. She would ask, the usual, and he would nod with a faint smile. He always ordered black coffee, never sugar, never milk. There was something almost comforting in the routine, as if both of them silently agreed to keep things simple. Yet slowly, almost without realizing it, their words began to stretch beyond the usual greetings. One evening, when the shop was emptier than usual, she handed him his cup and said casually, "You must really like black coffee. Most people order something sweet at night." He chuckled softly, and it was the first time she heard his laugh, quiet but warm. "I like things simple," he replied. "Too much sweetness hides the real taste." She smiled at his answer, not because it was funny, but because it gave her a glimpse into the kind of man he was. After that, their conversations grew little by little. Sometimes she asked if his day had been busy, and he would give vague answers, never going into detail but enough to keep her curiosity alive. Other times, he would ask if working late hours was tiring, and she would shrug, saying she was used to it. It was never anything deep, but these small exchanges created an invisible bridge between them. They were no longer just a barista and a customer, they were two people who quietly noticed each other. She began to pay more attention to the way he behaved. He always carried himself with calmness, but sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, she noticed the tiredness in his eyes. There were nights when he looked as though he had been through battles no one else could see. He would sit at his usual spot, staring out the window at the quiet street, his hands wrapped around the warm cup as if it gave him comfort. She wondered what thoughts filled his mind during those long silences. One rainy evening, when thunder rumbled softly outside, he lingered longer than usual. The shop was almost empty, and the sound of raindrops against the glass filled the silence between them. She found herself wiping the counter slower than necessary, just to steal glances at him. Finally, she decided to break the quiet. "You don't seem like the kind of person who likes being alone," she said gently. He looked at her, his eyes carrying something unreadable, and after a pause, he replied, "Sometimes, being alone is easier than explaining your loneliness to others." His words surprised her, and though he quickly changed the subject, the sentence stayed in her mind long after he left. She realized that, without knowing it, she was beginning to look forward to his visits more than she should. When she brewed his coffee, she put a little more care into making it, as if it mattered to him. When the door opened at the same time each night, she felt a small spark of relief, as though his presence kept the night from feeling empty. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. It wasn't just her noticing things either. One night, as she handed him his cup, he said quietly, "You always remember exactly how hot I like it." Not many people pay attention to such small details. His words made her cheeks warm, though she tried to hide it with a smile. "Well, you make it easy. You never change your order," she replied lightly. But deep inside, she felt something shift. His recognition of her effort made her realize their bond was no longer one-sided. The regular customers of the shop began to notice too. Some would whisper, joking about the man who always came at the same time, always ordered the same thing, and always sat in the same seat. A few even teased her when he wasn't listening, asking if he was secretly her admirer. She would laugh it off, saying he was just a customer, but deep down, she wasn't sure if that was true anymore. He was more than just a face at the counter. He was slowly becoming a part of her story. There was one night she would never forget. The shop had just closed, and she was cleaning up when she realized he was still sitting there, lost in thought. She hesitated before walking over to remind him they were closing. But before she could speak, he said quietly, almost as if to himself, "It feels peaceful here. Sometimes I wish time could stop in places like this." She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled and said, "Maybe that's what coffee shops are for, little pauses in life." He looked up at her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. It wasn't romantic in the usual way, but it was deep enough to make her heart skip. That night, after he finally left, she sat by the window for a few minutes, thinking about his words. She didn't know his story, didn't know what kind of life he lived outside those walls, but she felt certain of one thing: behind his calm and quiet manner, he was carrying something heavy. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to be the one who helped lighten it, even if just a little. Her curiosity grew stronger with each passing day, but she never asked him too many personal questions. She didn't want to push him away. Instead, she let their bond grow naturally, one conversation at a time. Some nights, they talked about simple things: books, music, even the weather. Other nights, silence was enough. There was a comfort in knowing someone was there, even without words. For him, she didn't know yet, but those nights were more than just coffee breaks. They were small moments of normalcy in a world that constantly demanded more from him. In her presence, he wasn't a man with endless responsibilities, he wasn't someone people admired from a distance, he was just a quiet man drinking his coffee. And that meant more to him than she could ever imagine. As the nights continued, she began to sense something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something softer, something that made her chest feel lighter whenever she saw him. And though she had no idea who he truly was, she felt that their story was only just beginning outside the walls of the little coffee shop. His life was a world she could not even imagine. To her, he was just a quiet man who came in every night, but when he stepped out of that shop, the weight of reality pressed on him like a mountain. He wasn't just an ordinary man looking for a cup of coffee. He was a CEO, responsible for hundreds of employees, endless meetings, and decisions that shaped the future of his company. People looked at him with respect and sometimes even fear, but behind the polished suits and the powerful image, he was simply a single father trying to hold everything together. Every morning began before the sun rose. He would wake to the soft sound of his daughter's voice calling for him. She was only 7, full of innocence and questions, with eyes that reminded him of her mother. Taking care of her was the most important part of his life, but it wasn't easy. He had to be a father, a protector, and at the same time, he had to be the leader of a vast company. There were days when he wished he could split himself in two: one half to sit by her side and read her bedtime stories, the other half to attend the endless boardroom meetings that demanded his presence. He had built a life of wealth and success, but it came at a cost. Loneliness had become his silent companion. He had friends, yes, but most were business partners or people who wanted something from him. He longed for simple connections, For conversations without hidden agendas. That was why he had chosen that small coffee shop in the first place. No one there treated him like a CEO or a millionaire. The young woman behind the counter didn't know who he was, and he wanted to keep it that way. For once, he could be just a man, not a title. Still, there were nights when exhaustion pressed heavily on him. He would sit in his usual corner with his black coffee, and memories would flood his mind. He thought of his late wife, the woman he had loved deeply, who had left this world too soon. He thought of how life had forced him to move on, not because he wanted to, but because his daughter needed him to be strong. And he thought of how different he seemed inside compared to the image people saw on the outside. To the world, he was powerful. To himself, he was simply a man trying not to break. The woman at the coffee shop didn't know these details, but she could sense his hidden battles in the way his eyes sometimes darkened with sadness. She noticed how his hands lingered around the warmth of the coffee cup as if it grounded him. She noticed how, when other customers laughed loudly, he remained quiet, lost in thought. She didn't know his story, but she could feel his loneliness, even when he didn't speak of it. One particular evening, after a long and draining day, he arrived later than usual. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and he looked more tired than she had ever seen him. She almost asked if he was okay, but something in his expression told her he didn't want pity. Instead, she handed him his coffee with a soft smile and said, "Long day." He gave her a faint smile back and replied, "Long life." The way he said it was half a joke, half the truth, and it made her heart ache even though she didn't know why. What she didn't realize was that these small moments in the shop were his refuge. No one here asked about profits, contracts, or strategies. No one here judged him as a widower trying to raise a child alone. The young woman treated him like an ordinary man, and that was a rare gift. For half an hour each night, he could breathe without the weight of the world on his shoulders. At home, his daughter was his light. He spent as much time with her as possible, helping her with homework, listening to her chatter about school, and tucking her into bed. But once she was asleep, the silence of the house often reminded him of everything he had lost. That was when he would drive to the coffee shop, needing the warmth of a place where he wasn't defined by his past or his wealth. There were evenings when he thought about telling her who he really was, but something always stopped him. He didn't want her kindness to change. He feared that once she knew, she might treat him differently, like everyone else did. He didn't want her to see his money, he wanted her to see him. And so, he kept his truth hidden, carrying his double life quietly, CEO by day, anonymous man with coffee by night. Meanwhile, the young woman at the shop found herself thinking about him even when he wasn't there. She would catch herself wondering what he did during the day, what kind of job made him look so tired every night. She imagined him as a teacher, maybe a doctor, perhaps even a writer. But never once did she guess that he was a millionaire CEO. To her, he was simply the quiet man in the corner, and that was enough. The bond between them grew stronger in the simplest ways. When she asked if he wanted an extra napkin, he would smile as if she had done something kind beyond measure. When he noticed she looked tired, he would gently say, "Don't forget to rest too." These were small words, small gestures, but they created a sense of understanding that neither of them could ignore. Yet behind his calm smile, he knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. He had already seen her kindness, her natural warmth, and he worried about what would happen once she discovered who he was. Would she see him differently? Would she pull away? Or would she continue to treat him as the man who came in every night for coffee? The coffee shop had become a bridge between two worlds, her world of simplicity and his world of complexity. And though neither of them realized it fully yet, their lives were slowly weaving together, thread by thread, like a story waiting to be told. For now, he kept his secret close. She remained unaware, treating him with the same honesty she showed every customer. And he, though burdened by the life he carried outside those walls, found peace in the small moments they shared. It was an evening like any other, or so it seemed at first. The coffee shop was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around the tables. She stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface, waiting for the familiar sound of the door. And as always, right on time, the bell above the entrance rang. He stepped in, dressed in his usual plain shirt and calm expression, but that night there was something different about him. He looked distracted, almost uneasy, as though his thoughts were somewhere far away. She greeted him with the same warmth she always did, asking softly, "The usual?" He nodded but didn't smile this time. His eyes seemed heavier than usual, carrying a kind of weight she hadn't seen before. She poured his black coffee, handed it to him, and he thanked her with a quiet voice before walking to his corner table. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A short while later, the door opened again, and two men in expensive suits walked in. They didn't look like the regular type of customers who visited a simple coffee shop at night. They scanned the place quickly, their eyes landing on him immediately. With respectful nods, they approached his table. She watched from behind the counter, puzzled. The men leaned down, speaking to him in low voices. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the change in his expression. His calm face grew tense, his jaw tightened, and his hand clenched slightly around the coffee cup. After a moment, he sighed, stood up, and excused himself. The men stepped aside politely as he walked to the counter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost apologetic. "I may have to leave early tonight." She gave a small nod, though confusion filled her mind. She had never seen anyone approach him like that before, and she couldn't help but wonder who he really was. Minutes later, after he left with the men, she turned on the small television that sat in the corner of the shop. It wasn't something she usually did, but the silence felt heavy. As the screen flickered on, the evening news played, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw his face appear. There he was, not in plain clothes, not as the quiet man who sat in the corner each night, but as someone completely different. He was being interviewed outside a tall glass building, cameras flashing around him, reporters calling his name. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "CEO and philanthropist attends gala event." Her hands froze. She couldn't believe her eyes. The man who came every night for coffee, the man who spoke so little but whose presence she had grown used to, was not just an ordinary customer. He was a millionaire CEO, someone important, someone powerful. She stared at the screen, her mind spinning. Everything she thought she knew about him suddenly felt small compared to the truth. That night, when he returned much later than usual, still dressed in a formal suit, she didn't know what to say. His tie was undone, his expression tired, and yet when he walked in, he looked at her the same way he always did, as if the world outside didn't exist here. She placed his coffee on the counter without a word. He noticed her silence, and after a long pause, he said quietly, "So you know now." She looked at him, unsure whether to smile or frown. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked softly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because here I didn't want to be that man. Out there, I'm a CEO. People look at me for what I own, what I can give, or what I can decide. But here, you treated me like a person. Not a title. Not a wallet. Just a man who came for coffee. And I didn't want to lose that." His honesty struck her deeply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the coffee machine filled the silence between them. She finally said, "I don't care about your money or your title. I only saw someone who looked lonely, someone who needed a place to rest." His eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed himself to show a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "I am lonely," he admitted quietly. "More than I let anyone know." I lost my wife years ago, and since then, I've been raising my daughter alone. People think I have everything, but they don't see the emptiness. They don't see how hard it is to carry both roles: leader to many, father to one, and yet feel alone in both. Her heart ached at his words. She had always sensed the sadness in his eyes but never imagined the depth of his story. She wanted to say something comforting, but all she managed was, "That must be very hard." He gave a small smile, one filled with gratitude. "Hard, yes. But she's worth it. My daughter is my whole world. Everything I do is for her." The way he spoke about his daughter revealed a tenderness that touched her. He wasn't just a CEO with power and wealth. He was a father, a man who carried love and grief, strength and vulnerability. And suddenly, she saw him in an entirely new light. From that night onward, their conversations deepened. He no longer hid his truths from her. He told her about his struggles, about the challenges of balancing late-night work with early mornings for his daughter. He shared how he sometimes drove aimlessly after putting her to bed, not ready to return to an empty house, which was how he had found her coffee shop in the first place. She listened, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. She didn't offer solutions, because she knew he didn't need them. What he needed was someone who would listen, someone who saw him not as a CEO but as a human being. And that was something she could give. Still, she couldn't deny that her heart was stirred by the truth. The thought of him being a millionaire CEO felt almost unreal compared to the man who sat at her counter each night. But what mattered most wasn't his wealth, it was the way he trusted her with pieces of his life that no one else seemed to see. Their bond, once built on small conversations, was now strengthened by honesty. She no longer wondered who he was, because she knew. And he no longer carried the burden of pretending, at least not when he was with her. The coffee shop remained their meeting place, but now it carried a deeper meaning. For him, it was still an escape, but now it was also a place where he could be himself fully. For her, it was no longer just work, it was the beginning of something far more significant than she had ever expected. Neither of them spoke of the future, not yet. But both felt the quiet shift in the air between them. The secret was no longer a wall. Instead, it became a bridge, connecting two lives that had once seemed worlds apart. The nights after the truth was revealed felt different, though not in a way that created distance. If anything, it brought them closer. She no longer looked at him as just the quiet man who ordered black coffee, she saw him now as a father, as someone carrying heavy responsibilities, as someone who had chosen her little coffee shop to breathe freely. He, in turn, no longer had to hide behind silence. He could sit across from her and speak without fear of being judged or treated differently because of his wealth. And yet, despite the shift in truth, the simplicity of their bond remained. He still came every night, ordered the same black coffee, and sat in the same corner. But now, instead of silence stretching endlessly, there were conversations that filled the air with warmth. They spoke of small things and big things, of the past, the present, and even little glimpses of the future. One evening, he brought a small book with him. She noticed it as he placed it gently on the table while sipping his coffee. "What's that?" she asked curiously. He smiled, sliding it across the counter for her to see. "It's a collection of bedtime stories," he explained. "My daughter loves them. I read to her every night, even if I come home late." She opened the book, flipping through the pages with colorful illustrations. "That's sweet," she said softly. "She must love that." "She does," he replied, his voice tender. "Sometimes she insists I do all the voices. I'm terrible at it, but she laughs anyway. And when she laughs, I feel like maybe I'm not failing her after all." The way he spoke about his daughter touched her deeply. She had always thought of him as lonely, but now she realized his love for his child filled much of that emptiness. He wasn't truly alone, he carried her laughter in his heart. Days turned into weeks, and their bond grew stronger. There were nights when the shop grew quiet, and he would help her stack chairs or wipe down tables before leaving. At first, she protested, saying he didn't need to, but he only smiled and said, "Sometimes it feels good to do something ordinary." She understood then that ordinary was exactly what he had been searching for. One night, he arrived earlier than usual, and this time, he wasn't alone. A little girl with big curious eyes clung to his hand. She looked around the shop with wonder, her small backpack bouncing as she walked. "This is the place I told you about," he said to her softly. "The one with the best coffee in the city." The young woman behind the counter froze for a moment, surprised to see him bring his daughter. The little girl's face lit up when she saw her father smile at the woman. "Is this your friend?" she asked innocently. He chuckled, nodding. "Yes, this is my friend. She makes very good coffee." The little girl beamed. "Hi. I'm Anna," she said cheerfully. The woman smiled warmly. "Hi, Anna. It's nice to meet you." She poured a cup of warm milk for the girl, adding a bit of chocolate powder on top, and slid it across the counter. "This one's on the house." The child's eyes sparkled as she took the cup in both hands. "Thank you," she said brightly. For the first time, the woman saw a different side of him, the father, the protector, the man who softened in the presence of his child. And in that moment, she realized just how deep his loneliness must have been before, and how much courage it took to balance everything on his own. From that day on, sometimes Anna came along too. She would sit at the table drawing pictures while her father sipped his coffee and talked quietly with the woman at the counter. The shop that once felt like a place of quiet mystery was now filled with small bursts of laughter and the innocence of a child's voice. It warmed the woman's heart more than she could explain. Still, outside those walls, his life remained demanding. There were nights when business pulled him away, when meetings stretched into the early hours, when stress weighed heavily on his shoulders. But no matter how busy he became, he always found his way back to the little shop. It was his anchor, the place where he wasn't CEO or millionaire, but simply a man who wanted to be seen. One evening, after closing time, they sat together at the counter. The shop was dark except for the soft glow of the lights above. He looked at her, his expression serious but gentle. "You know," he began slowly, "I never thought I'd find someone who made me feel normal again. For years, it's been about responsibilities, about being strong for everyone else. But with you, I don't have to pretend. You've given me something I didn't know I needed." Her heart raced at his words. She lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "You did," he said firmly. "You treated me like a person when no one else did. And that means more to me than you'll ever know." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of unspoken feelings, of gratitude, of something deeper than friendship. She realized then that what had begun as simple nightly visits had become something that neither of them could ignore. As weeks turned into months, their bond blossomed quietly. It wasn't a dramatic romance or a sudden whirlwind. It was slow, gentle, and real. He continued being the father he was proud to be, and she continued being the woman who gave him peace in the chaos of his life. They didn't rush into promises or declarations. Instead, they allowed their connection to grow naturally, like roots finding their way deeper into the earth. The small coffee shop, once just a stop for a lonely man, had become the beginning of a story that none of them had expected. A place where he found comfort, where his daughter found kindness, and where she discovered that even the most powerful people needed something as simple as understanding. Years later, people would still talk about the CEO, the millionaire, the man who had everything. But those closest to him knew the truth that his most precious treasure was not his company or his wealth, but the quiet nights spent in a little coffee shop with a woman who saw him for who he truly was. And for her, the girl who once thought she was just serving coffee to a stranger, life had changed in ways she never imagined. What began as a routine became a story of connection, of trust, and of love that was built not on wealth or power, but on something much stronger: genuine human warmth. The man who once came every night just for coffee was no longer just a customer. He had become a part of her life, and she a part of his. And though the world outside might never fully understand, inside that little shop, their story had found a home.